You've heard the phrase, haven't you? The greatest faith is the one that moves mountains. A beautifully poetic lie, more effective than any sermon, more satisfying than any hymn. But there's something amusing about it. A mountain, after all, doesn't need your faith to stand still, does it? It just exists. It simply is. You could believe in it, deny it, or curse it. The mountain won't budge. But you are the one who moves, sways, contorts your soul to fit into something divinely indifferent. And yet, we keep building temples, erecting altars, kneeling at the foot of colossal, unbothered mountains, praying to a God who's never been sure if he's supposed to listen or just let us babble into the night. It's a fine mess, really. Isn't it? So let me ask you this. If a monk forgets how to pray, does he still believe in God? Or has God simply forgotten how to listen? The question has more wrinkles than a 1,000-year-old scroll, I assure you. And here, in the dim light of flickering candles and a whispering, dust-filled room, the answer is neither neat nor clean. It is, instead, a muddled paradox wrapped in incense and mystery. Now, before you settle in, pretending this is just background noise, while you check your phone for the umpteenth time, do the holy thing, like the video and subscribe. Only if you feel called by the algorithmic divine, of course. It's fine, don't rush. The heavens aren't going anywhere, at least not tonight. In the corner of a forgotten valley, where the wind whispers secrets no mortal dares to repeat, there stood a monastery. Not the grand sort where monks climb golden stairways to heaven, but one of the humble, unnoticed variety. Here, among stones weathered by centuries and moss that seemed to bloom in shadows, our monk lived. His name? Well, let's not pretend it matters much. It could have been Brother Bernard or Brother Basil or something equally forgettable, for his soul, much like the monastery, had faded into a routine that could be summed up in a few simple words. Wake, pray, sleep, eat, repeat. He had long since abandoned the grand ambitions of holiness that once filled his youthful heart, or the dreams of sainthood that had once danced before his eyes like flickering candles. Now his mornings began with the same worn-out prayer, one he recited as effortlessly as a machine. Not from devotion, but from habit. Our Father, who art in heaven. He could hardly remember the last time those words held any weight. They had become mere sounds, like the creaking of old wood, like the rustling of dry leaves, like the soft scrape of his sandal against the cold stone floor. It wasn't that he no longer believed. No, it was more subtle than that. He had forgotten what it felt like to truly believe. A priest may say his prayers for salvation, but this monk, he recited his prayers to avoid silence. It was safer, quieter, and far less troubling. In the warmth of the morning light that filtered through stained glass windows, he felt a semblance of something holy, perhaps because the walls had become so accustomed to prayers they could no longer tell the difference between genuine devotion and polite routine. The scents around him, incense mingling with the musty air, the slight tang of old parchment, the earthy hint of wet stone, seemed almost holy. He had grown to cherish these smells, the ones that reminded him that, while faith may have dimmed, at least the monastery still had the decency to hold its shape. The silence here was rich, pregnant with history. Yet it was also painfully loud, echoing with the absence of anything profound. Outside, the world spun on, indifferent to his prayerful monotony. The crows cawed, the trees swayed, and the sun rose and set. Another endless cycle, another day that brought no answers. But the monk went on. one prayer after another, each word rolling off his tongue like the dust collecting in the corners of the chapel. They were rituals, after all, and rituals, even when empty, hold a certain comfort in their predictability. So, each day, as the light waned and the shadows deepened in the cool stone of the monastery, he would sit in the silence and wonder. How long could he pretend that this was belief? How long could he go on whispering words to a God whose response had become as elusive as the evening mist? Yet he did not question. Not yet. He simply prayed, as though prayer were his last act of rebellion against an indifferent universe. Ah, yes, belief. That delicate, fragile thing we clutch to our chests like a lover's last letter. Our monk had once known it well, long ago, before the words lost their sweetness. He believed, or at least he had believed. Not in the grandiose sense, mind you, but in the everyday miracles that people whisper about over dinner tables, the kind you can almost touch but never quite hold. Miracles of bread that never ran out, of prayers answered in mysterious ways, of the warmth that came with the promise of something beyond, something invisible yet real. At one time, his faith was so tangible, it had almost smelled like something. It had the scent of rain on dry soil, the earth's promise of renewal after a long drought. It wasn't the divine revelation of a burning bush or the blinding light of some unapproachable heaven. It was simpler than that. More like a comforting hum in the background of life, like a distant bell tolling somewhere just out of earshot, calling you to something better, something purer, something truer than this earthly existence. But oh, how the years had worn on him. Faith, in all its youthful splendor, had become a brittle thing. It had lost the luster it once had, now fading like the yellowed pages of a well-worn book. It was no longer alive. It was something recited, repeated, simply to fill the silence. The monk's faith had transformed, like a once vibrant fresco that had been covered in dust. Its vibrant colors dulled, its edges blurred. He still believed, yes, but he believed like someone who clung to an old photograph of a loved one long gone. There was still fondness, still a hint of warmth, but also the haunting realization that the person in the picture was no longer real. He prayed, not because he truly felt it in his bones, but because prayer was something you did, and doing was something that provided comfort. It was, after all, expected. And in the monastery, expectations were heavy, like the scent of incense that lingered in every corner. Believe, the Holy Book said. Have faith, the Scriptures urged, and so he did. Or, at least, he pretended to. It was a fine line, really, between devotion and a well-practiced routine. The monk often wondered if they were one and the same. And then there were the miracles. Or, rather, the idea of miracles. He had once believed in them wholeheartedly, with the fervor of a child clutching a cherished toy. The idea that a simple prayer could part the heavens, that a kind word could heal the sick, that a humble soul could move mountains. He had believed in those things with the blind passion of youth. But now, miracles seemed like something you read about in ancient scrolls, or heard about from the lips of elderly monks who had long ago lost their teeth and their teeth-gnashing zeal. The monk no longer believed in miracles the way he once had. Now, miracles were like discount sales at the market, suspicious, fleeting, and probably exaggerated. 2 for the price of 1, the merchants shouted. But the monk, he knew the game. He knew that a miracle, like a bargain, often came with fine print, hidden clauses that made you question whether it was worth the cost. Faith had become an echo of itself. It wasn't dead yet, but it had been hollowed out, like a tree whose bark had peeled away, leaving only the skeleton of what it once was. He still performed his rituals, but they were as much a part of the landscape as the dust and the silence. And in that silence, he began to wonder, was he still believing or simply going through the motions? And so, as all great doubts do, it began with something small, something so minuscule that at first it was barely noticeable. Like a splinter under the skin, hidden and barely felt, yet always there. It was a conversation, or perhaps it wasn't even that. Perhaps it was simply a passing thought, a fleeting whisper that brushed against his soul like a forgotten prayer. It was early one morning, as he sat in the dim light of the chapel, his hands resting on the cold stone of the altar, that the thought first crept in. He had just finished the morning prayers, the ones he could recite by heart without thinking. His gaze drifted toward the stained glass window, its colors fading with age, casting pale hues on the worn pews below. And there, in that half-light, something caught his eye. A crack in the glass, a fine line that had formed over years of weathering storms and neglect. It was nothing more than a fracture, a blemish on what was once perfect. But to the monk, it felt like a metaphor, a symbol of something that was breaking. It was then that he thought to himself, if the glass is cracked, can the light still pass through it? It seemed like such a simple question, but oh, how dangerous it was. A crack in the glass, a crack in the truth. He had prayed for years for the light of divine revelation, for the truth to fill his heart and mind, to wash over him like a cleansing flood. But what if the light was never pure? What if it, too, was broken, fractured, filtered through the cracks in the world and the cracks in his own soul? For the first time in years, he hesitated. He had always trusted in the light, in the certainty that it would find him no matter what. But now, he wasn't so sure. What if the light wasn't coming from a divine source at all, but from something far more human, something far more flawed? The question lingered, twisting and turning in his mind, gnawing at him like a rat in the dark. He had spent so long reciting the same prayers, following the same rituals, hoping that they would lead him somewhere. But now, he wondered if they were nothing more than a distraction, a way to fill the silence, to keep the cracks from showing. And then came the dream. It wasn't an especially remarkable dream. No burning bushes or glowing angels, no divine voices thundering from the heavens. It was simple. It was absurd, even. He dreamt that he was walking through a vast, empty desert, the sand stretching endlessly in all directions. He was parched, thirsty beyond reason, yet there was no water in sight. As he stumbled along, searching for something, anything, he spotted a figure in the distance, a tall man, dressed in white, with a long beard that seemed to float in the wind. The monk hurried toward him, desperate for guidance, for answers. But when he reached the man, all the stranger did was point to the horizon and say, "The oasis is not where you think it is." The monk stood there, bewildered, watching as the figure faded into the sand, leaving nothing behind but an endless empty desert. The monk awoke with a start, the words still echoing in his mind. The oasis is not where you think it is. And just like that, the seed of doubt had been planted. It was small, yes, barely more than a whisper, but it was there, nagging at him, refusing to be ignored. What if all his prayers, all his faith, all his devotion had been misplaced? What if the answers he sought weren't where he had been looking all this time? He sat in silence for hours, the quiet of the chapel pressing against him, heavier than ever before. And in that silence, he began to realize something far more terrifying than any divine judgment. He had no idea where to find the answers anymore. He had been walking in circles, praying into the void, hoping that something would reveal itself. But now, he wondered, was the void itself the answer? The days that followed were not marked by thunderclaps or visions of hellfire. No, the descent into crisis is never as grand or dramatic as the stories make it seem. It's quieter than that. It sneaks up on you, slipping through the cracks like a shadow that darkens with every passing moment, until it's impossible to tell whether the shadow is within or without. The monk's world, once so familiar and safe, had begun to feel like a room with walls that were too close, tight, suffocating, as if the air itself had grown stale. He continued his rituals, of course. It was what he knew. The prayers were a lifeline, but now they felt less like an offering to God and more like an attempt to placate the chaos inside him. The repetition of words, the familiar motions of crossing himself, lighting the incense, the faint smell of burning wax, it all became the backdrop to his unraveling mind. He would sit in the chapel, his hands trembling slightly as he moved through the familiar motions, the incense curling up in swirls of smoke that seemed to mock his own confusion. Was this it? He wondered. Was this the fullness of faith? Was this what he had spent his life preparing for? If so, it felt terribly inadequate. Like a child who had been told a story only to find out the plot was far less impressive than the retelling. The silence of the monastery had always been a comfort to him. It was a place where the world outside was shut out, where the only sounds were the rustling of robes and the murmur of prayer. But now, the silence felt deafening. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was a reminder of something lost. The prayers felt hollow, as if the words themselves had become disconnected from their meaning. He would stand before the altar, recite his prayers with all the fervor of a man who had long forgotten why he was praying in the first place. The silence seemed to answer back with nothing. Nothing. The monks had always said that silence was divine, that in the absence of noise, God could speak. But the monk had begun to suspect that the silence, instead of being filled with divine whispers, was simply empty, hollow. Was God even here? He wondered. Or had he long since gone, leaving behind only echoes of prayers that no longer made sense? The rituals had become meaningless. They were just things to do, motions to complete. When he washed his hands, he wasn't cleansing himself before God. He was just washing his hands. When he lit the candles, it wasn't an offering to the divine. It was just a candle burning. Everything he once held sacred had been reduced to mere actions, hollow and devoid of meaning. His fellow monks didn't seem to notice the shift. They went about their daily routines, offering their prayers, maintaining the traditions that had been passed down for centuries. They didn't see the cracks in the walls, the subtle signs that the foundation was crumbling. They didn't see the look in the monk's eyes when he entered the chapel, that glimmer of doubt that had begun to creep in, like a slow poison working its way through his veins. He had tried to speak to one of them once, to express his growing discomfort, but the conversation had been as unsatisfactory as everything else. Faith is a gift, the monk had said to him, and faith is to be nurtured, not questioned. But that didn't answer anything, did it? Faith wasn't just a gift. Faith was a struggle, a wrestling match between the self and the divine, between belief and doubt. And for the monk, it had become a struggle he wasn't sure he could win. He found himself staring at the altar more often now, as if the cross in front of him would offer some sign, some direction. But it remained just a cross, a piece of wood, no more divine than any other. The flickering candlelight cast shadows that seemed to dance mockingly at the edges of his vision. The incense burned, filling the air with its sweet, pungent scent, but even the smell was starting to lose its comfort. It smelled only of decay now, the decay of faith, the decay of certainty. The monk no longer believed in the rituals. He no longer believed in the prayers. And worse yet, he no longer believed in God. He had tried to. Oh, how he had tried! But no matter how many times he recited the prayers, no matter how many candles he lit, no matter how many times he bowed his head in reverence, there was no answer, no revelation, no whisper from the heavens, nothing, just silence. It was in that silence that he began to realize the most terrifying truth. God might not even be real. Or if God was real, perhaps he was simply too busy to listen to one lonely monk in a forgotten corner of the world. And so the monk descended deeper into his crisis. The doubts that had once been whispers had now grown into full-fledged roars, filling his mind, drowning out the last remnants of faith he had left. The once holy rituals now seemed absurd, and every prayer felt like a desperate plea to a God who would never answer. He had come to a crossroads, and there was no turning back. And then, as if to confirm every nagging thought, the moment of complete rupture came, not in the way he had expected. It wasn't a blazing vision, a voice from heaven, or an overwhelming sense of clarity. No, the moment of quiebra, of breaking, was far quieter than that. It was the absence of the divine, and in its place, the crushing weight of nothingness. It happened one evening as the monk sat alone in the chapel. The flickering candlelight cast a dim glow over the stone walls, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly, as if they were reaching for him, pulling him deeper into the void. The scent of incense hung heavy in the air, but it had long since lost its sacred association. Now it was just the smell of burning herbs, of something fading, something disintegrating into dust. The walls of the chapel, once so comforting, now felt oppressive, closing in on him like the walls of a tomb. He had come to the altar, as he always did, to offer his evening prayers. The words, once filled with such meaning, now felt hollow on his tongue. Our Father, who art in heaven. The words were familiar, yet foreign. He uttered them without thought, mechanically, as if reciting a poem he had memorized long ago. But this time, something snapped. It wasn't the words nor the ritual. It was the absence of any sense of divinity in the air, the absence of God himself. And so the monk knelt before the altar, his hands shaking, the weight of years of doubt and unspoken questions pressing on him. And in that moment of stillness, something inside him broke. His mind, once full of confusion, was now filled with an unbearable emptiness. He didn't know what to pray for anymore. He didn't even know who he was praying to. A thought, dark and fleeting, passed through his mind. What if I've been praying to nothing? The realization hit him like a physical blow. It wasn't the anger of a fallen believer, nor the pride of one who feels betrayed by the divine. No, it was something far more unsettling. It was the cold, bitter truth that had always been there, just beneath the surface. God might not be real, or he might be so distant that it didn't matter. And yet, even in the face of this truth, there was no great revelation, no burst of enlightenment. Instead, and there was a quiet, unsettling sense of release. The monk sat in the silence of the chapel, a silence now heavier than ever before, and for the first time in years he felt free. Not free in the sense of liberation, but free from the suffocating weight of a faith that had never been truly his own. In that moment, the monk laughed, not out of joy, but because he realized how absurd it all was. How absurd the rituals had been. How absurd the years of prayer and devotion had been. Here he was, sitting in the chapel surrounded by the walls of a monastery that had once been filled with sacred meaning, and yet it was all just a facade, a performance, a game. He had spent his life trying to appease a God who may have never existed, or worse, a God who had long since grown tired of hearing his prayers. There was nothing but silence. No divine answer. No divine voice. Just the whisper of the wind outside, carrying with it the faint scent of the earth, the faint scent of life, the life that had always been there, right beneath his nose, waiting for him to see it. He stood slowly, his body stiff from kneeling for so long. The candle light flickered one last time, casting a final, trembling shadow across the stone floor. And then, as if in a final act of defiance, the monk did something he had never done before. He blew out the candle. The darkness that followed was not the kind of darkness that fills you with fear or dread. No, this darkness was strangely peaceful, almost comforting. For the first time in years, the monk felt as though he could breathe again. The weight of belief had been lifted, and with it, the fear of divine retribution, of moral obligation, of spiritual duty. In the darkness, he was free. He stepped out of the chapel into the cold night air. The stars above him were distant, cold, uncaring. Yet, for once, the monk did not feel lost. In fact, he felt whole. He didn't need to look for answers anymore. He didn't need to pray for divine intervention. He didn't need to pretend that God was there. He wasn't sure where he was going or what he would do next. But for the first time in his life, the monk felt he was exactly where he needed to be, standing in the vast, empty night, staring up at a universe that was as silent as the chapel, but far more honest. And so the storm had passed, not with a great crash, not with the sound of a thunderclap that shakes the heavens, but with the slow, inevitable quiet of an ocean that has reached its calm after a long, tempestuous battle. The monk stood outside, the night stretching endlessly before him, the vastness of the world laid out like a forgotten manuscript, untouched, unread, unimportant. The weight of his earlier crisis now seemed to drift away, not gone, but settled into the soil, like the last traces of a storm's rain sinking into the earth. It had been a hard-won quiet, a peace born not of divine grace, but of human understanding. Yet, as with all silences, it was uneasy. No matter how deep you try to bury your questions, they always resurface in moments like these, when the world is still, when you are alone in the vastness of your own thoughts. The monk stood in the cold night, breathing in the crisp air as though he were tasting something for the first time. The silence around him was thick and palpable, like the dust that filled the chapel. He could almost hear it, the quiet hum of existence, the slow ticking of time, the murmur of the stars, and beneath it all, the weight of the unspoken. In the distance, the monastery loomed, its stone walls now cast in the shadow of the night. It was still the same place, still the same rituals, still the same motions, and yet it no longer held the meaning it once had. He had walked away from it, but not in anger. No, there was no fury in his heart, only resignation, a quiet acceptance that what he had once believed was simply a chapter that had come to an end. He had no answers now, no grand epiphanies, no divine revelation to fill the empty spaces that had once been crowded with the noise of prayer. What was left? What could he possibly hold on to now? The wind howled through the trees, and the monk closed his eyes, letting the cool air sting his face. For the first time in years, he felt the world around him, not as a thing to be conquered or understood, but simply as it was. There was no need for explanation, no need for justification. There was only the world and his place in it. It was strange. The silence felt like both a beginning and an end, though questions still lingered, like old echoes, but now they no longer held the power they once had. They were just questions, and in that there was a strange sort of freedom. The weight of having to find an answer, to discover the right path, had been lifted, leaving only the raw simplicity of being alive in a world that made no promises. The stars above flickered coldly in the sky, indifferent to the monk's musings, just as they had been indifferent to his years of prayer. And yet there was something comforting about their indifference. The universe didn't need to care. It wasn't supposed to. It wasn't an answer to all the monk's questions, nor was it a guide to any kind of higher truth. It was simply there, in all its vast emptiness and unknowing. The monk had expected more from the silence. He had expected some kind of profound understanding to arise from the stillness, some divine whisper that would lead him back to the light. But nothing came. There was only the emptiness, only the cold wind, only the stars above. And for once, he didn't mind. He stood there, in the silence, and he let it wash over him, not as something to be filled or solved, but as something that simply was. The darkness of the night was deep, and he could feel it in his bones. But it wasn't a threatening darkness. It was the kind of darkness that you find in a quiet room when the lights go out. The kind of darkness that allows you to see things you had missed in the harsh light of day. The stars above, distant and cold, seemed to shimmer with a kind of quiet knowing. They were not answers. They were simply there. And so the monk stood, in the vastness of it all, knowing that he was now just another part of the same great indifferent universe. The wind picked up again, stirring the trees, and the monk smiled, a small, bittersweet smile. For the first time in years, he felt a strange, almost absurd peace. The world had not changed, nor had the divine come rushing in to save him. But in the silence, in the emptiness, there was something profound. The recognition that perhaps the search for answers was itself the great illusion. Perhaps the silence, the unknowing, was all there was. And perhaps that was enough. And so he stood there in the silence, no longer seeking, no longer praying, but simply being. It was, as always, a small thing that came next. Not a booming voice, not a heavenly apparition, not even the kind of divine intervention you might expect from a monk who had finally broken through the fog of his own doubts. No, it was something far subtler, perhaps too subtle. So subtle, in fact, that it was almost as if it never happened at all. The monk had grown accustomed to the emptiness. After all, the world had never been more silent, and silence had become his strange, uninvited companion. Yet in the stillness, a flicker of something strange, something unfathomable, stirred deep within his chest. It wasn't a feeling of divine presence, nor a dramatic revelation of spiritual truth. It was more like an old memory, one that hadn't crossed his mind in years. He had seen it before, once upon a time, perhaps in a dream, or perhaps in a moment of youthful arrogance, when he thought he understood everything. But now it was just a feeling, as fleeting as a shadow. It was the faintest sense of, what? A presence, an awareness. It seemed to fill the empty space around him, like the slightest movement of air that no one else could detect. He tried to focus on it, to name it, but it slipped through his grasp, like sand in the wind. It was neither comforting nor alarming. It simply was. He stood in the middle of the courtyard, the cool night air brushing against his face, his eyes scanning the dark horizon, and for a brief moment he felt as if something or someone was watching him. The thought was absurd, of course. There was no one, no divine gaze, no divine will. Just the monk, standing in the dark, staring up at the stars, feeling the weight of the world's indifference pressing in on him. But the sensation lingered. He shook his head as though to rid himself of it, but it remained, like a splinter in his mind that refused to be dislodged. What was it? What had he felt? Was it divine? Was it real? Or had his mind finally begun to collapse under the weight of the years, under the weight of nothingness? The question remained unanswered. And yet there it was, this fleeting feeling of something just beyond his reach, something that had always been there, lurking in the background. Perhaps it was the shadow of something he had once believed, or perhaps it was nothing more than his own desperate desire for an answer. But in the stillness, there was also something else, the strange sense that this feeling was not meant to be understood. It wasn't meant to be dissected or explained. It was a reminder, perhaps, that not all answers need to be found, not all mysteries solved. Maybe, just maybe, the question was the answer, and the answer was that there was no answer. The monk laughed quietly to himself. It was the same laugh he had laughed so many times before. But now it was different. It wasn't a laugh of bitterness or defeat. It was a laugh of acceptance, of resignation. Perhaps he would never know what the feeling was. Perhaps the answer would never come. But in that moment, standing beneath the stars, he no longer cared. The silence was enough. The uncertainty was enough. In that very not knowing, he found an odd kind of peace. The wind shifted again, rustling the leaves around him, and for a brief, fleeting moment he thought he saw a figure standing in the shadows of the trees, just on the edge of his vision. But when he turned to look, it was gone. Nothing but the darkness, the trees, the silent stars. Had it been a vision, a trick of the mind? Or had he seen something that he was not meant to see? The monk wasn't sure, but he also didn't care. The universe was full of such moments, full of things that flicker and fade, things that never reveal themselves fully, things that dance in the edges of our awareness and disappear before we can name them. And maybe that was the point. Maybe the point was not to grasp, but to be. And so the monk stood there in the night, the cool wind on his face, and allowed the feeling to wash over him once more. Perhaps there was a God. Perhaps there wasn't. But in that moment, in the vast expanse of the universe, beneath the indifferent stars, the monk realized that it didn't matter. What mattered was that he was still here, still breathing, still standing, and that was enough. The monk walked away, the gravel crunching beneath his feet, his steps slow and measured, as if he were walking away from more than just the chapel or the monastery or the rituals that had once filled his life. He was walking away from an entire version of himself, one that had clung to certainty, to belief, to the idea that everything could be neatly ordered into boxes with labels like faith and truth and divinity. But as he walked through the darkened courtyard, past the flickering torches, and the stoned paths that led back to the chapel, he couldn't help but feel that something had shifted. It wasn't a grand revelation. There was no divine voice from the heavens proclaiming, "Well done, my child. You have reached enlightenment." There were no trumpets, no choirs, no heavenly choirs. There was only the sound of his own footsteps, echoing in the stillness of the night. The monk didn't know what to believe anymore. He didn't know if there was a God, if there was a divine plan, if any of it mattered. He didn't know if he was meant to find answers, or if he was simply supposed to live with the questions, the void, the unanswered prayer. Maybe there was no answer, after all. Maybe all those years of prayer had simply been a way to avoid confronting the fact that in the end we are all just here, in this strange, mysterious world, trying to make sense of the absurdity of our existence. But the monk didn't feel sadness or regret. No, he felt something else, something oddly freeing, freedom. The freedom to accept that he didn't know, the freedom to step into the darkness without expecting to find the light, the freedom to let go of the need to control, to understand, to solve. And so he walked through the night, the stars above him still indifferent, the wind still whispering through the trees. Maybe God was out there, somewhere in the vastness. Maybe not. Maybe the universe was a vast, indifferent machine that didn't care one way or the other about his petty human struggles. And yet, in that uncertainty, there was something profoundly human about it. There was beauty in the not knowing, in the acceptance of our own smallness, in the face of an incomprehensible cosmos. The monk didn't have answers, and perhaps that was the point. Perhaps the answer was that there was no final answer, just the journey, the search, the constant unraveling of the self, the constant questioning, the constant seeking. And even in that there was grace. As the monk reached the edge of the monastery, where the stone paths met the wilderness, he stopped and turned back, looking at the dark silhouette of the chapel against the night sky. It was the same chapel, the same old building, the same old world, and yet, for the first time, he saw it with new eyes. The cracks, the dust, the fading paint, the forgotten prayers, they were all part of the grand, absurd tapestry of existence. And so he smiled, not a triumphant smile, nor a weary one, but a small, contented smile. Perhaps there was no divine intervention, no grand revelation, but there was life, in all its messy, imperfect, uncertain glory. And that, the monk realized, was enough. The monk wandered into the night, his footsteps soft on the earth, fading into the quiet of the world around him. The stars, as distant as ever, shimmered coldly above him, indifferent to his journey, to his questions, to his answers. And yet, in that indifference there was something comforting. The universe did not owe him understanding, nor did it offer him any, and that, perhaps, was the truest freedom of all. And so, we come to the end of this story, but the end, like all things, is only an illusion. The journey continues even if the path is unclear, even if the destination is lost in the mists of uncertainty. But remember, dear listener, it's not the answers that matter, it's the questions, and the questions are endless. Now, if this story has kept you awake a little longer tonight, perhaps in contemplation, perhaps in doubt, consider this. The search for truth, for meaning, for understanding, is a journey that never truly ends. But if you're still searching for more, if you feel the call of the unanswered question, the unspoken prayer, then come back and subscribe to Religious Night Stories, where faith never sleeps, even if you do. After all, the journey never truly ends. It simply continues, one question at a time.